Well, with this wonderful find of an apple, I think it's only fitting to tell a story that focuses around an apple. Today we're going to be reading Snow White, and it's going to be by the Brothers Grimm. So there might be some differences between this version and the Disney one. Maybe you can spot them. Once upon a time, a queen sat sewing at a window made of beautiful ebony wood. Looking up at the snowflakes drifting gently onto the windowsill, she pricked her finger with the needle. 3 drops of blood fell onto the sill. The bright red drops looked so beautiful next to that white snow and black wood. The queen said to herself, "If only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony." Soon after, the queen gave birth to a daughter who was indeed as white as snow, and as red as blood, and as black as ebony. Everyone called the princess Snow White. Then the good queen died. A year later, the king remarried. The new queen was beautiful, but she was also vain. She couldn't stand the thought of anyone being more beautiful than she. Every day she looked into her magic mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?" And every day the magic mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of them all." That made the queen happy, for she knew the mirror never lied. But every day Snow White grew more beautiful. By the time the girl was 7 years old, she was even more beautiful than the queen. One day the queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?" This time the mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, and yet I have to tell what's true. Snow White's 1,000 times more fair than even you." The queen turned green with envy. Hatred and pride grew like weeds in her heart, giving her no peace. Finally, the queen told one of her hunters, "Take Snow White out into the forest and kill her. Then bring back her lungs and liver so I can be sure she's dead." The hunter took Snow White into the woods. He was about to stab her when Snow White cried, "Dear hunter, please don't kill me. I'll run farther into the woods and never come back." The hunter, taking pity on the girl, let her go. "The wild animals will soon eat her up," he thought, "but at least I won't be her murderer." Then he killed a wild pig and brought back its lungs and liver. The queen had them boiled up with salt. Then, thinking they were Snow White's lungs and liver, the queen ate them for dinner. Deep in the forest, Snow White kept running away, past thorny brushes and across sharp stones. Wild animals darted nearby, but none ever harmed her. Just before dark, the girl saw a little cottage and went inside to rest. The house was tiny but perfectly neat and clean. A little table was set with a white tablecloth, 7 little plates, 7 little spoons, 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little mugs. 7 little beds, all covered with snow white sheets, were lined up against the wall. Snow White was very hungry and thirsty, but she didn't want to take everything away from any one place. So she ate a little bread and a few vegetables from each plate, and she drank a drop of wine from each mug. She was so tired that she decided to try out the beds. Some were too long, some were too short, but the 7th bed was just right. So she lay down in it and fell sound asleep. Soon the 7 dwarfs who lived in the cottage came home from work. After lighting their candles, they noticed that things were not as they had left them. The first dwarf said, "Who's been sitting in my chair?" The second dwarf said, "Who's been eating from my plate?" The third dwarf said, "Who's been eating my bread?" The fourth said, "Who's been eating my vegetables?" The fifth said, "Who's been eating with my fork?" The sixth said, "Who's been cutting with my knife?" The seventh said, "Who's been drinking from my mug?" Then the first dwarf noticed that his sheets were wrinkled. "Who's been sleeping in my bed?" he demanded. 5 of the other dwarfs exclaimed, "Someone's been sleeping in my bed too." And then the 7th one noticed Snow White lying sound asleep in his bed. The dwarfs gathered around the sleeping child. "Oh my goodness," they whispered. "What a beautiful child! We must let her sleep." So each dwarf took a turn sleeping on the floor until it was morning. When Snow White first woke up and saw the dwarfs, she was frightened, but they seemed friendly, so she told them her name and explained what had happened. The dwarf said, "If you will cook, wash, sew, knit, make our beds for us, and keep our house neat and clean, then you can stay. We'll give you whatever you need." "Gladly," said Snow White, with a grateful heart. Every morning the dwarves went into the mountains to dig for silver and gold, and every evening Snow White had dinner ready for them. But during the day the girl was all alone. The good dwarfs warned her to be careful. "Your stepmother will soon find out where you're hiding. Do not let anyone in." Meanwhile, at her castle, the queen once again asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, yet Snow White's still more fair than you. The girl's alive, she works all day, for 7 dwarfs far, far away." The queen's hatred and envy grew wild. They would give her no peace until she was once more the most beautiful woman in the land. So the queen disguised herself as an old woman and went to the house of the 7 dwarfs. Knocking at the door, she called out, "Beautiful things for sale, pretty scarves in many colors. Would you like to try one on?" Thinking the old woman looked honest, the innocent child unlocked the door. "Come here, child," said the woman. "Let me tie this scarf properly." The old woman placed the scarf around Snow White's neck. Then she tied it so tightly that the girl, unable to breathe, fell to the ground. "Now we'll see who's the fairest one of all," the queen muttered and hurried away. Soon the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw their beloved Snow White lying on the ground, they were sure she was dead. Then they noticed the scarf and cut it in 2. Snow White began to breathe, and little by little she came back to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they told Snow White, "That old woman was really the wicked queen. You must be careful and do not let anyone in." When the wicked queen returned home, she went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, yet Snow White's still more fair than you. The girl's alive, she works all day for 7 dwarfs far, far away." The queen turned pale with horror. Snow White was still alive. Using her powers as a witch, the queen made a poisoned comb. Then she disguised herself as another old woman and went to the house of the 7 dwarfs. Knocking at the door, the wicked woman called out, "Housewares for sale, pretty combs at a good price. Would you like to try one?" Snow White called through a window, "Go away, I can't let anyone in." "You can at least take a look," said the woman, showing Snow White the poisoned comb. The child liked it so much that she unlocked the door. "Come here, child," said the wicked woman. "Let me comb your hair properly." As soon as the comb touched her hair, Snow White fell down unconscious. "Now, my beauty, you are finished for good," the queen sneered and walked away. Fortunately, the dwarfs came home soon after and saw the girl lying on the ground. Suspecting the stepmother, they pulled out the comb. Snow White came back to life and explained what had happened. Once again, the dwarves warned her to be on guard and not to open the door for anyone. Back home, the queen again asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?" Again the mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, yet Snow White's still more fair than you. The girl's alive, she works all day for 7 dwarfs far, far away." The queen turned red with rage. "Snow White must die," she screamed, "even if it costs me my life." This time the queen used her witchcraft to make a poisoned apple. Its outside was so beautiful that none would be able to resist eating it, but even the smallest bite was deadly. Then the queen disguised herself as a farm woman and went to the house of the 7 dwarfs. When the queen knocked at the door, Snow White stuck her head out a window and said, "I can't let anyone in. The dwarves have forbidden it." "Then I'll just hand you an apple." "No," said Snow White. "I'm not supposed to take anything." "Afraid it might be poisoned." "Then I'll cut the apple in two. You eat the red half, and I'll eat the yellow." Seeing the woman enjoying the beautiful apple, Snow White could no longer resist. But the queen had been careful to poison only the red half. So as soon as Snow White took a bite, she fell to the ground, dead. The queen let out an evil laugh. "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony, this time the dwarfs will never bring you back to life." Back at home, the queen asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?" The mirror hesitated. Finally it answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of them all." At last her envious heart was at peace, at least as much as an envious heart can be at peace. When the dwarfs came home that evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground. There was no scarf to cut off, no comb to pull out. They tried everything they could to bring her back to life, but nothing helped. The dear child was dead. The 7 dwarfs gathered around Snow White. For 3 days they wept and mourned, but her beautiful red cheeks made her look so fresh and alive that they couldn't bring themselves to bury her in the dark ground. Instead, they put Snow White in a glass coffin. On it, in gold letters, they wrote, "Snow White, Princess." They carried the coffin to the top of the mountain. At all times, one of the dwarfs stayed there to watch over her. Animals, too, came to mourn Snow White. First an owl, then a raven, and finally a dove. Snow White lay in the coffin for a long, long time, but she always looked fresh and alive, as if she were asleep, not dead. She was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony. One day a prince was traveling through the forest. He saw the coffin with the beautiful Snow White inside, and read what was written in gold letters. When he came to the little house of the dwarfs, he said, "Let me have the coffin. I'll give you whatever you want." But the dwarfs answered, "We would not sell it for all the gold in the world." "Then give it to me, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and cherish her as if she were my wife." Hearing these words, the dwarfs took pity on the prince and gave him the coffin. As the prince's servants carried it away, they happened to stumble. The sudden movement freed the piece of poisoned apple that had been stuck in Snow White's throat. Suddenly the girl opened her eyes. "Where am I?" Overjoyed, the prince told her, "You are with me, and I love you more than anything else in the world." After he explained everything, the prince said, "Come with me to my father's castle and be my wife." Snow White fell in love with him. And so they planned a royal wedding and invited Snow White's stepmother. After the queen dressed for the wedding, she asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, and yet I have to tell you what's true. The new young queen's 1,000 times more fair than even you." The evil woman let out a curse. Although she was afraid to go to the wedding, her envious heart would give her no peace until she saw the new young queen. As soon as the wicked stepmother entered the castle, she realized that the bride was Snow White. And the prince had prepared a punishment for the stepmother. A pair of iron shoes had been heating all day over burning coals. The stepmother was told to put on the pair of red-hot shoes. Then she was forced to dance in them until she fell down dead. And that is the story of Snow White. Quite different than the Disney version, just a little bit. Snow White was also a child. Fun times. Well, I hope you enjoyed this story, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!